Chapter 1, Routine. The shrill beep of the alarm clock pierced the early morning silence, and Ted's hand moved almost reflexively to silence it. Lying in bed for a moment longer, he stared at the ceiling, the familiar cracks and patterns a testament to the years gone by. At 43, these mornings had become more about reflection than anticipation. Beside him, Eliza lay still, her presence more like a memory than a reality. He watched her, noticing how even in sleep, she seemed distant. A mix of sadness and resignation settling in his chest. He remembered the early days, the laughter and shared dreams that filled this very room. Now, it felt like living with a ghost. Her body was there, but everything else about her seemed far away. Gently, so as not to wake her, Ted slid out of bed and began his morning routine. Brush teeth, shave, shower, and finally dressing in front of the mirror, each step felt rehearsed, a silent dance he had mastered over the years. As he dressed for work, his reflection in the mirror stared back at him, a reflection of an aging man caught in the mundanity of a 9-to-5 job, his dreams and aspirations dulled by the repetitive grind of daily life. He looks at the bed reflecting in the mirror. His wife of nearly 17 years, slept soundly, her back turned to him. He remembered the days when they'd wake wrapped in each other's arms laughing and flirting, never getting enough of each other. What happened to us? Ted pondered, his heart aching with a mix of longing and frustration. He missed the connection they once shared, missed the woman who used to look at him like he was the only one in the world and made him believe anything was possible. He still loved his wife, but those days now seemed like distant memories. Time had slipped away so fast he had not even noticed. With one last look at his sleeping wife, Ted heads downstairs. The morning sun filtered through the sheer curtains, casting a warm glow over the kitchen where Ted sat at the coffee table, nursing a steaming mug of coffee. The house was quiet, save for the occasional hum of the refrigerator and the distant chirping of birds outside. Ted glanced at the clock on the microwave, noting that Alan would be arriving soon to pick him up for their daily carpool. As he took a sip of his coffee, lost in thought about the day ahead, the sound of footsteps announced the arrival of his teenage daughter, Amy. Her presence seemed to fill the room with a different energy, one that Ted found both comforting and increasingly distant. Amy walked in, her eyes never leaving the screen of her phone as her thumbs flew over the keyboard, engrossed in a conversation Ted could only guess about. "Morning, sweetie," Ted ventured, hoping to catch a sliver of her attention. "Morning," she mumbled, not looking up. "How's school going?" "Any plans with friends today?" He tried again, attempting to bridge the widening gap between them with mundane questions he hoped would spark more than a monosyllabic response. "Fine and no," Amy replied, her focus unwavering from the glowing screen. Ted watched her, the silence stretching between them, filled only by the soft taps of Amy's texting. He remembered a time when mornings were bustling with chatter, when Amy would share every detail of her life with him, from the trivial to the significant. She used to seek his advice on everything, and he cherished those moments of closeness. Now, as she stood before him, a growing teenager immersed in her digital world, Ted felt a pang of nostalgia for those simpler times. "All right, well, have a good day at school." "Love you," Ted said, a hint of sadness in his voice, longing for a connection that seemed to slip further away with each passing day. "Yeah, love you too, Daddy. Bye," Amy said, finally glancing up briefly to offer a half smile before turning to leave, her attention immediately returning to her phone. Ted sat there for a moment longer, the warmth from his coffee mug seeping into his hands, a stark contrast to the coolness of the morning's exchange. He missed his little girl, the one who used to talk his ear off about everything under the sun. As he set his mug down, he couldn't help but wonder when the gap between them had begun to widen, leaving him longing for the past even as he faced the reality of her growing independence. The sound of Alan's car honking outside snapped Ted out of his reverie. He stood up, taking one last look at the empty space Amy had occupied just moments before. With a heavy heart, he grabbed his keys and headed out the door, the echoes of his daughter's diminishing presence lingering in his mind. Outside, Alan leaned against his fancy car, the epitome of bachelorhood. His easy smile and carefree attitude were a stark contrast to Ted's more reserved demeanor. Eliza had never warmed up to Alan, often labeling him a playboy and a bad influence. Even Amy never liked Alan, but for Ted, Alan's friendship was a respite from the growing loneliness of his life. Morning. Ready for another exciting day at the office? Alan's voice was laced with sarcasm. Ted forced a smile, as ready as I'll ever be. As they drove away, Ted couldn't shake his feelings of loss. He felt like a stranger in his own home, a spectator trapped in an endless spiral he called life. As they drove to work, his mind was a whirl of thoughts, the life he was living, so different from the one he had dreamed of when he was younger. Today, without his knowing, the delicate balance of his life would be challenged, setting off a chain of events that would change everything. Chapter 2: The Unsettling Proposal. The clock on Ted's office wall ticked monotonously, marking another day in his uneventful 9-to-5 job. Surrounded by the hum of computers and the occasional chime of phones, Ted found himself lost in the repetitive rhythm of his daily routine, answering calls, filling out reports, and looking at the clock on the wall waiting for the day to end. Occasionally he glances at the smiling faces in the photograph on his desk. It was an old picture of Eliza, Amy, and himself, captured in a moment of genuine happiness, a stark contrast to the strained smiles of recent times. Ted's cubicle, a small island in the sea of grey office partitions, was a testament to his unfulfilled dreams. Once, he had aspired to own his own business, but those dreams had been shelved in favor of the stability his current job provided for his family. Though the job paid well enough, it came at the cost of his aspirations. Ted often found himself wondering what might have been if he had taken the risk. His colleague Alan, the office charmer, was always flirting with the younger women in the office. Ted couldn't help but feel a tinge of envy at Alan's ease with the opposite sex, and often made Ted reflect on his own good fortune in marrying someone as beautiful as Eliza, who even in her late 30s, remained a striking figure. Their boss, a stern but fair woman, had a reputation for being a ball-buster. Ted often found himself burdened with extra work, a fact he accepted without complaint. There were office rumors about Alan's sexual relationship with the boss, which Ted suspected might be true, given the preferential treatment Alan seemed to receive over everyone else in the office. Around noon, Ted's lunch break was as monotonous as the rest of his day. The break room, with its flickering fluorescent lights and the hum of the vending machine, was hardly a sanctuary. He sat alone at a worn table, unwrapping a plain sandwich he had made that morning. The room was stark and uninviting, the walls adorned with outdated motivational posters that nobody bothered to read anymore. As he took a bite of his sandwich, his mind wandered to the dreams he had shelved, the business he never started. His gaze drifted to the other tables, where younger colleagues gathered, their laughter and chatter a stark contrast to his peaceful solitude. It was then he overheard the conversation between Jenna and Liz, two of the newer employees. They were talking animatedly, their voices carrying across the room. "I'm telling you, Jenna, open marriages are the real deal," Liz said with a knowing smile. "It's like having the best of both worlds. You're not tied down, but you still have someone to come home to." Liz leaned in, her interest piqued, absorbed in this concept of an open marriage her friend was selling her. As the two co-workers continued to talk, Ted felt a twinge in his heart. Is that what relationships have come to, he thought. A series of fleeting encounters, with no depth or commitment. The concept of an open marriage was so foreign to him, so contrary to the vows he had taken and believed in. He couldn't help but feel a sense of loss for the values he held dear, for the sanctity of marriage that seemed to be eroding in this new world order. He finished his lunch in silence, his appetite lost to the turmoil of his thoughts. The rest of his break passed in a haze, the voices of Jenna and Liz echoing in his mind, a stark reminder of how far removed he felt from this new societal norm. He was relieved that Eliza and he had been brought up in a more moral time, but he was concerned about his daughter and what she was being led to believe in this new age. That evening, when Ted arrived home, he was greeted with an unusual sight. Eliza was in the kitchen, humming a tune he hadn't heard in years, her demeanor light and carefree. "Dinner will be ready soon," she said, flashing him a smile that felt like a relic from a bygone era. Ted, caught off guard by this change, responded cautiously, "This is a surprise." "What's the occasion?" "Just felt like doing something nice," Eliza replied, her back to him as she stirred the pot on the stove. As they sat down to eat, the conversation flowed more naturally than it had in months. Ted shared anecdotes from work, even managing a laugh about Alan's latest office escapade. Then, as they were finishing their meal, Eliza's expression shifted to something more serious. "Ted, there's something I've been thinking about," she began, her voice hesitant. "What would you say if I suggested we open up our marriage?" Ted's fork clattered to his plate. Chapter 3, A Reluctant Yes. In the aftermath of Eliza's proposal, the air in the room had grown thick with tension. Ted sat, frozen, as Eliza enthusiastically began to outline the benefits of an open marriage. She spoke of rejuvenation, a newfound happiness, and exploring uncharted territories in their relationship. "It's about bringing life back to our marriage, Ted," Eliza said, her eyes alight with a fervor he hadn't seen in years. "Imagine the excitement, the passion. It could even revive our own intimacy." Ted could barely process her words. They swirled around him like a maelstrom, echoing the conversation he had overheard at work. The same justifications, the same reasoning. It was as if there was a script to this madness. As Eliza delved into the rules of open marriage, Ted's mind drifted. He was back in the break room, the voices of his younger colleagues bouncing around his head. Was this really happening? Was his wife proposing they live out the very scenario that had made his stomach churn just hours earlier? He snapped back to reality when he heard Eliza's voice, sharper now. "What do you think, Ted?" His throat felt dry, his voice barely a whisper. "We can go to a marriage counselor." He knew even as he said it that it was a feeble suggestion. Eliza's warm smile disappeared, replaced by a cold, serious expression. She looked at him in disgust at his weakness. "Marriage counseling won't fix this, Ted. If you don't agree to this, I'm leaving you and I will make sure Amy blames you for breaking up her family." Ted looked at Eliza, hardly recognizing the woman he had married. The loving, caring wife he once knew seemed to have vanished, replaced by someone evil that he couldn't understand. His heart ached at the thought of Amy caught in the middle of this nightmare. Images of Eliza with other men haunted his mind, along with imagined taunts about his inadequacy. He felt a deep sense of shame, as if he were betraying himself and his values. With tears streaming down his face, he begged Eliza to reconsider once more, to think of their family. But her response was unwavering, cold, and final. "It's happening, Ted, whether you like it or not. We can get a divorce right now if you'd prefer." A sense of helplessness enveloped Ted. The prospect of a divorce was a chasm too wide to contemplate. Financial ruin, losing Amy, the thoughts were suffocating. Eliza held all the cards and he had to fold. Defeated and broken, Ted nodded and muttered a reluctant agreement, unable to meet Eliza's triumphant gaze. She stood up, her smile now chilling. "I'm glad you see reason. I've got a date tonight. Make sure the kitchen is clean before you go to bed," she said, not even skipping a beat as she walked past him to go get ready for her date. As Eliza's footsteps faded, retreating upstairs to the bathroom, Ted, in a daze, sat there for a continuing to stare at his empty plate. Then mechanically rose from the table, his plate in hand. His movements were robotic, a hollow echo of a routine long ingrained. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if he were wading through a sea of his own despair. He set the plate in the sink, the clatter of porcelain against stainless steel sounding distant, almost unreal. His hands moved of their own accord, turning on the tap, the rush of water a sharp contrast to the numbing silence that filled the house. Ted's mind was a tumult of broken thoughts and shattered dreams. He watched the water cascade over the dishes, his hands mechanically scrubbing at stains that seemed insignificant compared to the stain now etched upon his life. The soap bubbles, reflecting the kitchen lights, held no magic, no escape from the reality that had just come crashing down upon him. In this moment, as he stood alone, the weight of Eliza's words crushed him. He had become a mere shadow, a puppet whose strings were pulled by her whims now. The realization that he had lost control, that he was now at the mercy of a situation he could neither comprehend nor confront, was suffocating. The kitchen, once a place of family gatherings and shared meals, now felt like a prison cell. The walls closed in around him, bearing silent witness to his internal collapse. Each dish he washed was not just an act of cleaning, but an act of surrender, an acknowledgement of his defeat. In the solitude of the kitchen, with only the dishes for company, Ted allowed himself to grieve. Chapter 4: Shifts in the Household. Time passed and Ted found himself in the passenger seat of Alan's car, staring blankly out the window. The familiarity of the route to work, which he had shared with Alan for years, did nothing to ease the turmoil churning inside him. His colleagues' attempts at conversation fell on deaf ears as Ted's mind was besieged by images of Eliza with other men as she continued to go out every night since she had forced him into an open marriage that night. He had hoped she would reclaim her senses and remember what it felt to be in love with him with their family, but each night she became more and more distant. She was like a love-struck teenager every time she went out, never telling him where or with whom she went with. Most of the time, Ted laid awake worried if something had happened to her until she returned the next morning smelling of alcohol and of another man's smell. It was hell for him. At work, Ted found himself lost in a fog of distress. His usual focus was shattered. Each phone call he answered, every report he filed, felt like moving through a viscous pool of his own turmoil. The office buzzed around him, but he was trapped in a silent storm of his thoughts, replaying Eliza's demands and what they meant for their marriage. The ticking of the clock, the clacking of keyboards, the occasional laughter from colleagues, it all seemed distant, muffled by the overwhelming noise in his head. He missed cues in conversations, his replies delayed and distracted. Ted was a shell, going through the motions but devoid of presence. His distraction culminated in a serious error, a glaring mistake in an invoice that would have overcharged a major client. If not for the boss's timely intervention, the consequences would have been disastrous. Ted's boss, a formidable woman known for her firm leadership, summoned him to her office, her disappointment palpable. "Ted, this is completely unacceptable," she began, her tone sharp. "You've always been reliable, but this," she waved the erroneous invoice in the air, "this could have cost us dearly. What's gotten into you lately? You seem distracted and unfocused." Ted stood there, head bowed, unable to articulate the chaos that had upended his life. Her office felt claustrophobic, the walls closing in on him. He didn't know how to answer, nor did he want to, thinking of the shame and humiliation it would incur if his boss ever found out. For a moment there was uncomfortable silence. Seeing as she was never getting an answer and seeing his sad demeanor, she continued in a calmer voice, taking pity on him. "I like you, Ted, and I've always appreciated your dedication, but if something like this happens again, I won't have a choice. I'll have to let you go. Do you understand?" Ted nodded, murmuring an apology, his voice barely audible. As Ted turned to leave, this boss lady called him one more time, stopping him. In a concerned motherly voice, she told Ted if he needed someone to talk to, her door was always open. Surprised, Ted turned and saw her warmly smiling at him. He could see the pity and concern in her eyes, which he had never seen before, not from her, the ball buster at work. Ted didn't vocally respond but awkwardly nodded and then exited. The threat of losing his job on top of everything else was a jolt back to a harsh reality as he returned to his desk. Ted sighed a long calming sigh, trying to settle himself and focus before it was too late. Unseen by Ted, from across the room Alan's concerned gaze watched him. Moments later, in the small, cramped break room, the air was stale, mingling with the scent of reheated meals. Leaning against the counter, Ted stood across from Alan, his eyes distant, lost in thought. Alan, leaning forward with a look of concern, broke the silence. "You've been off your game lately, Ted. What's going on, man?" Ted hesitated, the words catching in his throat. It felt like crossing a line, exposing the turmoil of his private life. But the weight of his secret was too much. "It's Eliza," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. She's convinced we should have an open marriage," she asked. "No," she demanded it. Alan's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Open marriage? Like, seeing other people?" Ted nodded, the pain evident in his eyes. "Yeah, and she's not just talking about it. She's already out there, seeing other people." Alan whistled softly, shaking his head. "Man, that's tough. Why don't you just cut her loose? No one deserves that bullshit." Ted sighed, his hands trembling slightly. "I wish it were that easy. If I leave, I lose everything. My home, most of my savings, and what scares me the most is losing Amy." Alan nodded, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by a rare seriousness. "I can't imagine being in your shoes, Ted. But living like this, with all this stress, it's not good for you. You're falling apart." "I know," Ted admitted, a sense of helplessness in his voice. "I had hoped she'd realize it's a mistake and come back to our family, but she's so different now, like I'm living with a stranger that goes out every night to hook up with a new man." Alan leaned against the vending machine, his usual playful demeanor subdued. "Man, I had no idea things were this bad. You've got to take care of yourself, though. You can't let this destroy you." "I'm trying, but I feel trapped," Ted confessed, his eyes downcast. "Listen, Ted," Alan said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Maybe it's time to think about yourself a bit. If Eliza's going out and hooking up, maybe you should too. Have you thought about that?" "What do you mean?" Ted replies. Alan's expression softened. "I can't even imagine what you're going through. But maybe, just maybe, this could be an opportunity for you too. You know, to get back in the game." "Wait, what?" Alan shrugged. "I'm just saying, maybe it's not all bad. You could meet someone, have a little fun. It doesn't have to be serious. Hell, I could help you set up a profile on one of those dating sites." As Alan left the break room, Ted sat there, his mind was a tumult of confusion and despair. Alan's words, though well-intentioned, offered little solace and had even made him feel worse. As the workday drew to a close, the drive home was overshadowed by a heavy sense of dread. Each mile that brought him closer to his house seemed to tighten the knot in his stomach. The reality of his new home life, marred by the open marriage arrangement, loomed over him like a dark cloud. Pulling into the driveway, Ted's heart sank at the sight of Eliza's car. The thought of facing her, of seeing the woman he loved now so distant and changed, was almost too much to bear. He sat in the car for a moment, gathering his strength. Alan, being the good friend, sat there silently and just waited until Ted exited his car. He watched with sympathetic eyes as his friend walked like a zombie towards the house. As Ted entered the house, the sound of Eliza getting ready upstairs was like a siren song of a life falling apart. The familiar smells of home, once comforting, now felt foreign. The walls of the house, once filled with memories of laughter and love, seemed to mock him now. He found Eliza in their bedroom, radiant and buzzing with an energy that was both infectious and heartbreaking. She was dressing for another date, her outfit more revealing than anything she had worn before. Ted watched her, a mix of admiration, longing, and despair churning within him. Going out again, he managed to ask, his voice strained. Eliza glanced at him, her smile not reaching her eyes. Yes, don't wait up, she replied casually, as if discussing something as mundane as the weather. Ted felt a surge of hopelessness. Here was the woman he had pledged his life to, now a stranger under his own roof. He wanted to reach out, to pull her into his arms and rewind time to when they were happy. But he knew it was futile. Eliza, He started, his voice trailing off. He wanted to tell her he loved her, to remind her of the life they had built together. But the words felt hollow, even to him. Yeah, love you too, babe, Eliza responded distractedly, her attention more on her reflection in the mirror than on him. Ted's heart ached at her indifference. The gap between them felt insurmountable. He felt as if he didn't even exist anymore. She slinked past him, telling him not to wait up, the sway of her hips a painful reminder of what he was losing. It was as if she was moving further away from him with each step, both physically and emotionally. Left alone in the echoing silence of the house, Ted's thoughts spiraled. The memories of happier times haunted him, each one a stark contrast to the cold reality he now faced. He felt like a ghost in his own home, invisible and insignificant. He wandered aimlessly through the house, each room a testament to a life that was slowly slipping through his fingers. In a moment of desperation, he reached for the vodka, seeking any form of escape from the pain. The sharp burn of the alcohol was a welcome distraction from the dull ache in his chest. Ted's mind went back to Alan's suggestion of the dating site. The very thought of it filled him with a mix of revulsion and curiosity. Could he really go through with it? Would it even make a difference? His family, the cornerstone of his life, was unraveling before his eyes, and he felt powerless to stop it. Hours later, as he laid in their bed, the empty space beside him a stark reminder of Eliza's absence, Ted's mind raced with questions and fears. The silence of the room was oppressive, punctuated only by the occasional sound of a car passing by outside. Ted's thoughts became a whirlpool, dragging him deeper into despair. The idea of Eliza out with someone else gnawed at him, an unending torture. He tried to push the images out of his mind, but they clung stubbornly, feeding his growing sense of inadequacy and betrayal. The house felt larger, emptier. Every creak and whisper of the building seemed to echo his despair. Ted lay there, staring at the ceiling, the hours stretching endlessly. As the night wore on, his thoughts turned darker, wondering what he had done to deserve this fate. Had he been too complacent, too blind to the signs? The questions circled in his mind, each one a pointed accusation of his failings as a husband, as a father. In the midst of his turmoil, Ted heard a car door outside. For a brief moment, hope flickered in his chest. Perhaps Eliza had come back, had realized the mistake of what she was doing. But the sound of Amy's laughter quickly shattered that illusion. Peering out the window, he saw his daughter saying goodbye to someone in an unfamiliar car. It was well past midnight, far too late for a 16-year-old to be out. When Amy entered, she was startled to see her father up and waiting. "Dad, what are you doing up?" she asked, a hint of defensiveness in her tone. With arms crossed, Ted's voice was laden with a mix of apprehension and disapproval. "Amy, what's going on? It's way past your curfew. Where have you been?" He attempted to assert some parental control, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. With a defiant edge, Amy countered, her words sharp with rebuke. "Really, Dad? Isn't Mom the one you should be worrying about?" The challenge in her voice hung heavily between them, punctuating the strained atmosphere. Taken back, Ted just stands there in silence, unsure of how to answer. The tension in the room spiked as Amy, fueled by her frustration, furiously displayed her phone to Ted. It was Eliza's dating profile. The photos showcased Eliza in a series of provocative poses, each one more daring and revealing than the last. Ted's eyes widened in shock, his heart pounding as he took in the explicit nature of the images. It was Eliza as he'd never seen her before, transformed and unrecognizable from the woman he married into an evil temptress. For a moment, Ted felt as if the floor had dropped from beneath him. Nausea swirled in his stomach, a mix of revulsion and betrayal. He struggled to breathe, to comprehend the reality of his wife's actions laid bare on the screen before him. The intimacy they'd shared, now exposed and flaunted for strangers' eyes, left him feeling exposed and vulnerable. The profile, with its seductive promises and brazen confidence, was a stark departure from the life they'd built together. It was a declaration of Eliza's departure from their marriage as he knew it, a painful, tangible sign of how far apart they had drifted. Ted's mind raced, trying to reconcile the image of Eliza on the screen with the woman he thought he knew. The realization that she had so thoroughly embraced this new identity, without regard for him or Amy, cut deeply. He felt a profound sense of loss, not just for the partnership they once had but for the woman he loved, who now seemed like a stranger. As he stared at the screen, the comments and likes from strangers felt like jabs, each one a reminder of the public spectacle his marriage had become. Then, he saw it listed at the top of her profile. The bold declaration of her being in an open marriage was like a knife twisting in his gut. "How can you just stand by and let this happen?" Amy's voice pierced the heavy silence, her tone a mix of hurt and incredulity. Struggling for words, Ted managed a weak response, "Your mother and I are trying to sort things out." His voice betrayed his uncertainty, his words sounding hollow and unconvincing. Amy's patience snapped. "Sort things out? By letting her openly disrespect our family with this?" Her voice climbed, each word infused with a mix of disbelief and escalating fury. "Are you scared of Mom?" Ted winced, the truth in Amy's words hitting too close to home. "It's complicated, Amy," he murmured, though his heart wasn't convinced by his own words. "That's just it, isn't it? You're too scared to stand up to her. You're letting her turn our lives into a circus." Amy lashed out, her voice breaking with emotion as tears started to rise up. "At school today, my friends showed me that profile, Dad. Do you have any idea what it's like, having people laughing at you and others asking if your mom's available?" Ted stood, mute and shaken, as the gravity of Amy's words sank in. The pain and embarrassment she must have endured struck him deeply. "I'm so sorry, Amy. I never meant for any of this to affect you," Ted said quietly, his voice heavy with sorrow. "Sorry doesn't change anything, Dad." Amy replies, wiping a tear from her face. "You used to be someone I respected. As much as I hate Mom right now, I hate you more for letting this happen." Amy said bitterly, her words slicing through the last vestiges of Ted's self-respect. "You're not my father anymore." With those final, cutting remarks, Amy retreated to her room, slamming the door and leaving Ted alone in the dark, silent living room. The confrontation had laid bare the painful truth of his family's disintegration and his diminished standing in his daughter's eyes. Chapter 5: The Turning Point. Ted's car sliced through the quiet night, its headlights casting long, forlorn shadows on the road. His grip on the steering wheel was iron-tight, a physical manifestation of the turmoil churning inside him. Anger, frustration, and a deep-seated sense of betrayal swirled in a maelstrom of emotions that he could barely contain. His mind was relentlessly replaying the scene from earlier that evening. He had been just outside Amy's room, about to knock and attempt some semblance of a fatherly conversation, when her sobs had reached his ears. The sound of his daughter crying, so full of pain and heartbreak, had rooted him to the spot. It was a moment of stark, painful clarity. His family was crumbling, and it was largely due to his own inaction and capitulation. As he drove, Ted's self-reproach grew stronger. He berated himself for allowing Eliza to coerce him into this open marriage, for being so blinded by his fears that he hadn't seen the toll it was taking on his daughter. How had he allowed himself to be so clueless, so blinded by fear and insecurity, that he hadn't seen the damage this was inflicting on his own child? The guilt was overwhelming, a crushing weight on his already burdened conscience. With each moment he drove, Ted's anger at himself intensified. He was selfish and had been so consumed by his own inner turmoil and the chaos of his relationship with Eliza that he had failed to protect the one person who mattered most, his daughter. The resolve to end the open marriage agreement crystallized within him. This had to stop, even if it ended in divorce, and it had to stop tonight. As if guided by this newfound determination, Ted found himself outside a local bar where Eliza's car was unmistakably parked. His heart raced with a mix of dread and resolve. This was the moment he had to face, the confrontation that could potentially alter the course of their lives. Entering into the bar's parking lot, Ted's heart pounded in his chest wildly. He was no longer just a bystander in his own life, he was taking charge, driven by the need to protect his daughter and salvage whatever was left of his dignity. Enough is enough, Ted whispered to himself, glaring at his wife's car parked just in front of him a few spaces, his voice laced with both fear and determination. He was about to step into the unknown, not sure of the outcome, but he knew it was necessary. The night, silent and indifferent, seemed to hold its breath as he prepared to confront the situation head-on. But as Ted prepared to exit his car, the quiet of the night was suddenly pierced by laughter, a sound that once brought him joy but now filled him with dread. His eyes widened in disbelief as he saw Eliza and Alan emerging from the bar. They were laughing together, their body language intimate and carefree. This was Alan, the man he had trusted as a friend, the confidant to whom he had bared his soul about the agony he was going through. Hidden in the shadows of the parked cars, Ted watched the nightmare scene before him play out. Eliza playfully nudged Alan and Ted observed in disbelief as Alan responded to her playfulness, putting his arm around her and pressing her tightly against his body. The sight of them kissing, a kiss that spoke of intense passion and familiarity, was a gut-wrenching confirmation of his worst fears. Their ease with each other, the warmth of their gestures, it was a stark, painful contrast to the coldness and distance that had crept into his own marriage with Eliza. Ted felt an overwhelming sense of pain, not just by Eliza, but acutely by Alan. His friend's involvement in this deceit was a betrayal of a magnitude Ted had never known. As they got into Alan's car, leaving Eliza's behind at the bar, Ted felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted. The car pulling away seemed to take with it the last vestiges of his trust, both in his wife and his best friend. Long after they had disappeared from sight, in the solitude of his car, Ted's mind was panicking, struggling to comprehend the scene he had just witnessed. The sight of Eliza with Alan, his supposed friend, was more than just a betrayal, it was a desecration of all the trust and love he had ever known. How long had this affair been going on? The question tormented him, its implications spiraling through his mind like a relentless storm. As he grappled with this new reality, Ted's thoughts turned to Amy. Her recent words of disappointment, her tears behind her closed door, and her contempt for the situation at home echoed in his mind. How would she react to this latest, most painful revelation? The idea of telling her that her mother's infidelity now included his own best friend seemed unbearable. It felt like it would be the final blow to any semblance of respect she might still hold for him. The weight of the situation was suffocating. How could he face his daughter now? He envisioned Amy's disillusioned eyes, her harsh accusations, and felt a deep sense of failure. Not only had he failed as a husband and lost a friend, but now, it seemed, he had also failed as a father. In a moment of utter despair, Ted leaned back, closed his eyes, and pleaded a silent prayer into the darkness. "God, please help me," he murmured, seeking a sign, a direction, anything to help him navigate this chaos. There was a prolonged silence, the kind that feels heavy and laden with meaning. Ted sat unmoving, his eyes still closed, lost in the depth of his turmoil. Then, in the stillness, a subtle shift occurred. A sinister grin slowly formed on Ted's face, unseen in the darkness of the car. It was a disturbing, almost macabre expression that seemed at odds with the man he once was. In a hushed tone, laden with a dark, ominous resolve, he whispered, "I understand. Thank you, God." Opening his eyes, the unsettling smile faded. Starting the car with a calmness that bordered on unsettling, Ted pulled away from the scene that had shattered his world. The drive home was eerily serene, a stark contrast to the maelstrom of betrayal and deception he had just witnessed. Arriving home, Ted ascends the stairs to the bedroom. His steps were measured, each one echoing a sense of purpose rather than the despair one might expect. The bedroom, once a shared sanctuary filled with love and warmth, now served as a mere backdrop to his unnerving calm. Methodically, Ted prepared for bed. His actions lacked the heavy heart or emotional turmoil that the betrayal he had just witnessed would typically evoke. Instead, there was an almost robotic efficiency to his movements, as if he were detached from the emotional gravity of his situation. In bed, Ted lay still, his eyes open in the darkness. His mind should have been a tumult of pain and confusion, replaying the images of Eliza and Alan's betrayal. Yet, the disturbing calm that had enveloped him seemed to push these thoughts into the background. The house was silent, the kind of oppressive quiet that amplifies one's inner turmoil. Yet, in Ted, there was a notable absence of the expected inner chaos. Instead, there was a chilling stillness, as if the shock had numbed him into a state of disconcerting tranquility. Then as he lay enveloped in this unnerving calm, that slow, sinister smile began to creep across Ted's face once more. It was not a smile born of joy or contentment. Rather, it was a smile that seemed to stem from a dark, almost malevolent place within him. This smile was unsettling in its implications, suggesting a departure from the man he once was, a descent into something more ominous. Chapter 6: A New Dawn. The first light of dawn crept through the curtains as Ted awoke to find Eliza beside him, her presence marked by the faint, rhythmic sound of her breathing. She lay with her back to him, oblivious to his wakefulness. The usual pang of sadness, the emotional turmoil that had become his constant companion, was notably absent. Instead, there was a calm, a detachment that was new and unfamiliar. Ted lay there for a moment, observing Eliza. The remnants of her evening out, the scent of alcohol mixed with the unmistakable aroma of Alan, clung to her. In any other circumstance, this would have stirred a maelstrom of emotions in Ted: anger, betrayal, heartache. But this morning was different. His eyes traced the outline of her form under the covers, and rather than pain, his lips curled into a small, enigmatic smirk. It was a smirk not of warmth or affection, but of a man who had crossed that invisible line. With a yawn, he got out of bed, leaving Eliza undisturbed, and began preparing for his day. In the shower, Ted hummed to himself, a stark contrast to his usual morning demeanor. There was an unusual spring in his step, an energy that seemed out of place given the events of the previous night. Dressed in his work clothes, a crisp white button-up shirt, and a tie, he whistled a cheerful tune, a sound so unusual in their home that it briefly woke Eliza. Confused by this abrupt change in Ted's mood, Eliza watched him for a moment. His unexpected cheerfulness puzzled her, but exhausted and still feeling the effects of the night, she mumbled something about him having lost his mind and drifted back to sleep. Dressed and ready for the day, Ted made his way to the kitchen, his whistle a constant companion as he headed downstairs. As he prepared his coffee and sat down with the newspaper, there was a rhythm to his actions, a sense of normalcy that was almost surreal. The kitchen, usually a space of silent reflection or hurried morning routines, now echoed with the unfamiliar sound of Ted's whistling. "Good morning, Amy," he said, his voice unexpectedly gentle as he noticed her entering into the kitchen. Amy lingered in the doorway, her appearance a visible testament to the emotional upheaval of the night before. Her eyes were red and puffy from tears, and her hair was in a state of disarray. She absent-mindedly tugged at the front of her shirt, a small gesture that Ted recognized as a sign of her nervousness. "Morning, Dad," Amy replied, her voice laced with hesitation. She was visibly taken aback by the unexpected calmness in her father's demeanor, so at odds with the man she had argued with the night before. Ted, maintaining his newfound sense of serenity, offered her a cup of coffee. "Would you like some coffee?" "I just made it," he said, gesturing towards the steaming pot with a casual ease that seemed almost surreal. Amy, standing uneasily, declined his offer. "No, thanks. I'm not really in the mood for coffee," she said, her fingers still fidgeting with her shirt. There was a pause, filled with unspoken words, before Amy nervously approached the subject of the previous night. "Dad, about last night. I shouldn't have said those things. I didn't mean to call you a." Her voice trembled, and she fought to hold back tears. Standing up from the table, Ted interrupted her, stepping closer with an unexpected gentleness. "No, Amy, I'm the one who should be sorry. You were right about everything you said." His voice was soft yet resolute, a stark contrast to the man she had confronted the night before. He reached out and pulled her into a comforting embrace, a rare display of affection from him. "I've been lost in a fog, but I see things clearly now. You're the most important person in this house, in my life. I promise I'm going to fix everything." Ted kisses the top of her forehead. Amy, overwhelmed by the warmth and sincerity in her father's words, couldn't hold back her emotions any longer. Tears streamed down her face as she clung to him, a mixture of relief and lingering confusion enveloping her. Ted held her, a reassuring presence in the midst of the emotional storm. The calm demeanor had washed away and been replaced with an angry gaze unseen by Amy. "It's okay, everything's going to be okay from now on. I promise," he whispered, his voice steady and comforting, but his eyes were filled with rage at that moment. They had hurt his daughter and they would pay for it. Chapter 7, Confessions. Alan, noticing a shift in Ted's mood during their morning carpool, ventured a comment. "You seem different today, Ted. Kind of upbeat. It's good to see, given everything that's been going on." Ted, staring out the window, responded with a hint of melancholy hidden beneath a veneer of acceptance. "I've just started to come to terms with things. You know, accepting what I can't change," he said, his voice betraying a mix of resignation and a faint trace of something else, perhaps a newfound resolve. Alan, driving, cast a quick glance at Ted. "Well, that's a healthy way to look at it, I guess." "Good for you, man," he replied, though a note of concern lingered in his voice. He sensed an undercurrent in Ted's words, an unspoken weight behind them. After a moment of silence, filled with the hum of the car engine and the passing scenery, Ted's voice cut through the quiet. "Alan, have you ever been in a situation where you knew something wasn't right but felt powerless to stop it?" His question, seemingly out of the blue, carried a depth of seriousness that caught Alan off guard. Alan, now more alert to Ted's mood, navigated the conversation carefully. "Yeah, I think we've all been there at some point." "Why do you ask?" Ted sighed, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape. "I think I've been fooling myself, ignoring the signs. Things with Eliza. They're not just complicated. They're broken. And I've been too scared to face it." The confession hung in the air, heavy with the gravity of Ted's realization. Alan, picking up on the sincerity and pain in Ted's voice, chose his words with care. "Ted, it's never easy to admit when things are falling apart. But facing it is the first step to figuring out what to do next." Ted nodded slowly, the acknowledgement of his situation seeming to bring him a measure of peace, albeit a painful one. "Yeah, I guess you're right. It's just that I feel like I've let down the people I care about the most. Especially Amy." The air in the car was thick with silence. Breaking the uneasy silence, Ted leans forward reaching for the glove box. Alan, you still have that gun, right? He asked, his tone casual but carrying an ominous weight. Caught off guard, Alan replied with a nervous chuckle, "What's up with the sudden interest in the gun?" But before he could finish, Ted reached into the glove box, pulling out the pistol with a calm, deliberate motion, and placed it on his lap pointed at the driver. The sudden appearance of the firearm sent a jolt of fear through Alan. "What the hell, Ted? Put the gun away, man!" Alan exclaimed, his voice shaking, as he instinctively swerved the car, almost hitting another vehicle speeding by. Ted, his expression still unnervingly calm, fixed his gaze on Alan. "Keep the car on the road," he commanded in a chillingly controlled tone. Alan, now visibly sweating and trembling, struggled to steady the car and regain his composure. "Ted, please, this isn't you. What's going on?" Ted didn't reply immediately. Instead, he stared straight ahead, his expression an unreadable mask, heightening the tension in the car. The pistol still on his lap and pointing towards Alan. Attempting to defuse the situation, Alan offered, "Ted, if something's on your mind, we can talk about it. We're friends, right?" Ignoring Alan's attempt at reassurance, Ted pressed on with a disconcerting calmness. "So, how long have you been sleeping with my wife?" His voice, steady and cold, carried an accusation that hung heavily in the air. Alan, sensing the seriousness in Ted's tone, fumbled for words, panic creeping into his voice. "Ted, I think you're imagining things." "I would never." Interrupting him, Ted coldly replied, "I saw you two at the bar last night." Realizing it was useless to hide it anymore, Alan's voice was a mix of panic and desperation, confessed. "About 6 months, Ted. But you've got to understand, it was Eliza who initiated it. She seduced me, man. I never intended to betray our friendship." Ted sat motionless, his expression stoic, but his eyes betrayed a deep sense of hatred. "And the open marriage, why didn't you two just keep sneaking around my back? Why bring it out into the open?" he asked, his voice cold, each word cutting through the air. Alan, his fear palpable, nodded vigorously. "Yes, all her idea," he blurted out, eager to divert the blame. "She said sneaking around was too tiring and stupid. She wanted to be empowered and free." A small, mirthless chuckle escaped Ted's lips, a sound more chilling than any display of anger. "Ted, you have to believe me. Eliza's been with lots of guys, not just me," Alan pleaded, his voice tinged with a desperate hope for absolution. "Yeah, but none of them called themselves my friend." His words hung heavy in the air, a stark reminder of the depth of Alan's betrayal. Chapter 8, Final. As afternoon approached, Eliza, clad in nothing but a trench coat, found herself standing outside Alan's humble home. She giggled to herself, thinking about the flirty text message from Alan, telling her to sneak over while he was playing hooky from work. Despite her initial reluctance, still feeling the effects of the previous night, the allure of Alan's charismatic charm was irresistible. As she approached the door, her phone chimed with a text message. Checking it, she saw a message from Alan, asking if it was her at the door. When she replied affirmatively, he texted back, telling her to come in as the door was unlocked. Eliza's heart fluttered with excitement as she pushed the door open. The scene inside was like something out of a romantic novel. Rose petals lined the floor, leading all the way to the bedroom, and candles adorned the house, casting a warm, inviting glow. It was a grand gesture, typical of Alan's flamboyant style, and it made her feel desired, something she felt was missing with Ted. Lost in the romantic ambience, Eliza let out a small jump and a laugh when her phone chimed again. Alan's message urged her to hurry up. With a playful smile, she shrugged off her coat, revealing the seductive red lingerie she had chosen for the occasion. Anticipation building, she made her way towards the bedroom. Eliza, still wrapped in the remnants of her playful mood, stepped into the bedroom where a romantic ambience had been meticulously set. The trail of rose petals led her to the bed where Alan lay. At first glance, he appeared to be sleeping, an inviting smile almost ready to play on her lips as she approached. The flickering candlelight cast a soft, warm glow over the room, making the scene feel like something out of a dream. Eliza, her heart fluttering with anticipation, moved towards the bed, her eyes fixed on Alan's motionless form. She was about to wake him with a surprise he wouldn't forget. "Time to wake up," she whispered playfully as she reached out to gently shake his shoulder. But the moment she touched him, a cold sense of reality gripped her. Alan's body was unnaturally still, too still. A second shake, firmer this time, yielded no response, no playful groan or sleepy smile she had expected. Panic began to set in as Eliza's playful demeanor vanished, replaced by a growing dread. She shook him again, more vigorously, her voice rising in both fear and desperation. "Alan? Alan, come on, this isn't funny." But there was no response, no movement. Then she saw the blood soaked into the sheets beneath Alan's body. The chilling truth dawned on her: Alan was not asleep. He was dead. A wave of horror washed over her, her mind racing to comprehend the nightmarish reality unfolding before her. Eliza's heart pounded in her chest, her breath quickened, and a scream built up inside her, struggling to find its way out. The romantic candles and rose petals now seemed grotesque, mocking her with their pretense of love and passion amidst the stark horror of the scene. Before she could fully process the shock or let out the scream that was clawing at her throat, a familiar voice broke the dreadful silence. "Hi honey," the creepy voice whispered. Eliza whirled around, her eyes wide with terror, only to find Ted standing there, his presence both unexpected and terrifying. The shock of seeing him, and then a sharp pain in the side of her skull, sent her into a dizzying spiral. The world around her spun into darkness, and she felt herself slipping into unconsciousness. The last thing she remembered being Ted's chilling greeting in the dimly lit, eerie room. Eliza slowly regained consciousness, confusion clouding her mind. A sharp pain throbbed at the side of her head, and as she reached to touch it, she felt a painful wet lump. The last fragments of her memory from before were hazy, but the grim reality quickly set in. In the dimly lit room, she could see Alan's lifeless body lying on the bed. A deep sense of despair engulfed her as she realized there was no need to check. His stillness told her everything she needed to know. Silent tears streamed down her face, mourning the horrific truth and her own dire circumstances. She rushed to the door, her hands frantically trying the handle, only to find it locked. In a burst of panic, she pounded on the door, her voice filled with fear and desperation. "Help! Somebody, help me!" The sound of footsteps approached from the other side, and then Ted's voice, cold and detached, pierced the silence. "You thought you could control everything, Eliza. You played with our lives as if we were pawns in your game. But in every game, there are rules, and every action has its consequence." Eliza's initial sense of relief at hearing Ted's voice quickly turned to horror. "Ted, open the door right now. This isn't funny," she demanded, trying to exert her will over him as she had done so many times before. There was no response, just a chilling silence. "Ted," she called out again, her voice now tinged with fear and uncertainty. Still, there was no answer, no sound but her own ragged breathing. Panic turned to terror as she realized Ted was not going to help her. Desperately, she whispered, overwhelmed with fear, "Ted, please." Finally, Ted spoke, his voice calm and resolute. "Amy and I will be fine from now on. Don't worry about us. Goodbye, Eliza." His footsteps echoed as he walked away from the door, leaving Eliza alone with the dawning realization that she was not going to make it out alive. Her fear erupted into a frenzy. She began slamming her fists against the door, her pleas becoming more desperate. "Ted, I'm sorry. Please, forgive me. Please. I'll change. But there was no response, only the growing sound of flames crackling outside. Ted had deliberately knocked over the candles, setting the curtains ablaze. The fire quickly spread, engulfing the living room and reaching the door of the room where Eliza was trapped. Smoke began to seep under the door, filling the room with its toxic embrace. Eliza coughed and choked, her eyes stinging as she realized the gravity of her situation. The heat from the fire outside was intense, the walls of the room growing hotter by the second. Eliza turned to the window, a potential avenue of escape, but her hopes were dashed as she saw it was nailed shut, an impenetrable barrier to her freedom. The room, once a haven for secret trysts, had become her inescapable death trap. As the smoke filled the room, Eliza's thoughts spiraled into despair. The realization of her impending doom was overwhelming, her fate sealed by the encroaching flames. The fire, which had started as a small spark from the fallen candles, now roared through the house with unstoppable fury. Trapped and alone, Eliza's final moments were consumed by the inferno. Her screams, her regrets, her fears, all were silenced by the all-consuming blaze. The clandestine love nest that once symbolized her secret desires was now nothing more than a fiery grave. Afterwards, horizons reclaimed. Perched on the picturesque edge of the bay, the beacon by the bay emerged as a testament to resilience, the dream of Ted, its owner, realized through grit, passion, and the echoes of a past he aimed to outdistance. Over the past 6 years, this seafood haven had not just grown in popularity but had burgeoned into a linchpin of the coastal community, its very foundation woven from the threads of a new beginning. The genesis of The Beacon by the Bay was marked by Ted's determination to redefine his and his daughter Amy's future, using the life insurance money from a chapter in their lives they both wished to close forever. What started as a venture to escape the shadows of yesteryear quickly turned into a culinary destination, renowned for its fresh, local seafood, inviting ambience, and a warmth that seemed to radiate from its very walls. Ted, at the helm of this enterprise, had discovered not just success in his business, but a profound sense of fulfillment and happiness that had long eluded him. The restaurant's thriving status was a daily reminder of how far he had come, transforming him into a figure of admiration and respect in the community. His newfound confidence and joy were evident in every interaction, a stark contrast to the man he once was, overshadowed by doubt and loss. Amy, though not officially a co-owner, was the heart of The Beacon by the Bay. Her involvement in the restaurant, from aiding with the daily operations to infusing the space with her vibrant energy, was invaluable. Her assistance was a testament to her love for Ted, her actions speaking volumes of her admiration and deep respect for her father's resilience and vision. Together, they were more than just family, they were a team, their bond strengthened amidst the hustle of kitchen orders and the clatter of dishes. The Beacon by the Bay stood as more than a dining establishment, it was a gathering spot where patrons felt like family, where stories were shared over steaming plates of seafood, and where laughter mingled freely with the salty air. It was a beacon of hope and renewal, its story resonating with those who sought comfort and joy in its cozy quarters. As Ted looked out over the bay, with Amy by his side, he couldn't help but feel a surge of pride and gratitude. The journey here hadn't been easy, fraught with challenges and steeped in personal growth. Yet, as he watched the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, he knew that every step, every decision, had led him here, to this moment of peace and contentment.